What's the strangest coincidence you've ever personally experienced? I met this girl who worked at the farmer's market. We would see each other on Saturdays and chit-chat occasionally. Eventually, we exchanged Instagram accounts and discovered we were both into home brewing and fermentation. She posted that she had 40 pounds of apples, but had run out of fermentation vessels. I reached out, found out we were close neighbors, and went to pick up the apples. We decided to hang out in a few weeks and compare our home brews. When we hung out, we really hit it off. She had just moved to Boston a year prior after touring with a band through Europe. She had only been to Boston once before in 2013, just for a weekend to play a festival. One day, we were lying in bed talking about a future where we had a farm and discussing our hypothetical pet pig, Francois. I mentioned that I had once had the chance to walk a piglet on a leash. As I scrolled through my phone to find a photo, I felt a strong pull, like a calling, to check a different photo nearby. I opened it and remembered that day. It was October 2013. I was outside my undergrad dorm enjoying a nice day when a brass ensemble walked by playing music. They stopped on a small platform outside, played for about 10 minutes for passers-by, and then moved on. I thought they were cool, so I snapped a photo. Back in the present, this photo seemed important. I showed it to her and asked, "Do you know this band?" She looked at me and said, "You see that person in the middle of your shot staring at you?" "Yeah, that's me." I completely lost my mind. The chance of seeing that band, her being in it, her being there that weekend, my photo centering her as she made eye contact with me, then encountering her 8 years later as neighbors, dating, and discovering that photo while we were side by side, it was surreal. I've had a lot of coincidences in life, but that one still gets me. For closure, I got a job I couldn't pass up in a new city, and she wasn't ready to move across the country. Coincidentally, that city was where she went to undergrad and had considered moving back to before we met. We still talk and have discussed her moving there in June. We ended things when I left Boston in December, but we both know we'll likely find each other again. Story 2. Not my story, but a friend's. He had recently gotten out of the military and struggled with a drinking problem. One night, he drove home drunk and, tragically, hit a motorcyclist, killing him. He was facing court, fully expecting to be punished for his actions, when something unexpected happened. The wife of the motorcyclist reached out to the court. She explained that her husband had schizophrenia and suffered from unpredictable bouts of rage. On the night of the accident, he had left her a voicemail, threatening to come to her house to harm her. She had prayed desperately that something would prevent him from reaching her. A bizarre twist, she argued that my friend, though drunk and unaware, had inadvertently saved her life by causing the accident. She called him an angel who had been sent at precisely the right moment. She even played the voicemail in court. Of course, the court still had to deliver justice. My friend was sentenced to 3 years for drunk driving and vehicular manslaughter, serving 2 for good behavior. The judge acknowledged the tragic and strange circumstances, but the law had to be upheld. Story 3. My mom and I were heading out for a morning shopping trip, so I was in the shower pretty early, around 7:15 a.m. My grandpa had been under the weather with a cold, which was always a concern since he only had one lung, but he'd been recuperating at home and seemed perfectly fine when we spoke the day before. Chipper, even. Out of nowhere, mid-shampoo, this thought suddenly flashed through my head. We're not going shopping. He's died. I brushed it off immediately. I get intrusive thoughts now and then, and this felt like one of those random morbid blips your brain throws at you for no reason. I told myself to shut up and get on with it. 5 minutes later, my mom banged on the bathroom door. She said, "Your grandpa's passed away in his sleep. We need to go to his house." I froze. I don't believe in psychics, precognition, or any of that, and I've never considered myself particularly intuitive. Honestly, I'm as dense as a brick most days. But that moment still haunts me, even 14 years later. Story 4. This happened to my brother when we were kids. We grew up in a pretty poor family in Eastern Europe and shared one old PC between us. Both of us were obsessed with gaming, so anytime our parents went out, it was basically a battle over who got to play. One day, my parents planned a day trip to the mountains. My brother, who was around 12 or 13 at the time, refused to go because, of course, video games were more important than fresh air and family time. When we got back that evening, he looked kind of pale and weirdly relieved to see us. Later, he told me what happened. Apparently, while he was playing, he randomly looked up at the light and said out loud, "If demons exist, the light should go off." And right that second, the light went out. He freaked out, sat in the dark for a while, and then waited the rest of the day for us to come home. At the time, it terrified him. Now, looking back, it was probably just a burnt-out bulb. But still, what a perfect coincidence. Story 5. When I was in high school, I got into a minor car accident one morning on my way to school. After getting checked out at the hospital, the doctor said I was fine and sent me home. When I walked upstairs into our house, I noticed odd things scattered across the floor. Then I heard voices downstairs. I went to my mom's closet where we kept the guns, grabbed a rifle, and crept to the staircase. Our house had a set of stairs, a landing with a phone, then 3 smaller steps that led into a hallway. I stopped on the landing, listening. One man was in my brother's room trying on clothes. The other was in my other brother's room. They hadn't realized I was there. Then the phone rang. I aimed the rifle toward the hall and said into the receiver, "I'm being robbed," gave my address, and told them to call the police. Both men stepped out of the bedrooms wearing ski masks. One had the bluest, whitest eyes I'd ever seen. We stared at each other for a few long seconds. Then they bolted out the back door, where they'd broken in. The police arrived within minutes, but didn't catch them. Later, I found that they'd stolen all the magazines for the guns. My rifle hadn't even been loaded. The caller that day was my future sister-in-law. 6 months later, it happened again. Another minor car accident. Another morning I came home early. This time, they'd made food and left the kitchen a mess. I grabbed the hidden gun, this one loaded, and crept downstairs. They were in my brother's rooms again. I called out, "This time I'm loaded," and pointed the gun. The phone rang again. It was my future sister-in-law. Again. And I told her I was being robbed. The men ran, dropping stolen speakers on their way to the van. The same police officers responded. We installed an alarm system. They were never caught. 15 years later, I walked into a vacuum repair shop to get mine serviced. There were several people waiting. The man behind the counter looked up at me and froze. Those same cold blue eyes. Everyone in the shop felt the tension instantly. We stared at each other for a long, heavy moment. He knew that I knew. I picked up my vacuum, turned around, and walked out. Then I called my mom. Story 6. I'd just gotten my first car without automatic headlights. It took me a few weeks to get used to remembering to turn them on manually. About 2 weeks in, I pulled out of a parking lot one night in a nearby college town. Lights off. A cop saw me, I realized immediately, and flicked them on, but it was too late. He pulled me over. I wasn't high, but I was young, insecure, and had no idea about my rights, so when he asked to search my car, I let him. He found a couple grams of weed. I had to go to court and enroll in a short program to clear the misdemeanor. Those 2 months were the strangest of my life, full of weird coincidences that made me question reality a bit. But the strangest part was the man who ran the program. His name was Joe, and we clicked instantly. His wife had passed recently, and I shared her name. It's an uncommon name, and that hit him hard. He liked to talk. What should have been 15-minute meetings often turned into hour-long conversations about life, grief, and mistakes. He confided in me. He even tipped me off about my surprise drug tests and scheduled them, so the only safe day I could smoke was my birthday. He was just that kind of person. Real and kind. A few weeks in, I found out my old friend from college was in the same program. We hadn't seen each other in years, and she lived an hour away. Somehow, she'd been caught the same way I was, pulled over for a headlight issue. Same small amount of weed, in the same town, just a day after me. She was struggling, really struggling. Homeless sometimes, dealing with mental health issues, losing grip on things. She failed both her drug tests and was supposed to serve 10 days in jail. At my final meeting, Joe and I had another long talk, and at the end, I told him everything about my friend. I told him she wasn't doing well. That jail might break her. I don't know why he trusted me so much, but he did. He made it, so she passed. He let her go. I still can't explain everything that happened during those 2 months. None of it made sense, but I honestly believe I went through all that to help save my friend from something that could have pushed her over the edge. 10 days in jail doesn't sound like much, but for her, it might have been everything. Story 7. Several years ago, I had a husky who was getting on in years. We were very in tune with each other. enough that I knew exactly which whines or little noises meant what. He had one particularly distinct sound that signaled when he needed a bathroom break. As he got older, those breaks started happening in the middle of the night too. Old man problems, am I right? Lol. When he was a bit past 11, my fiancé and I started noticing something strange. I could hear him from across the house, even when he wasn't anywhere near me. Somehow, I'd always wake up in the middle of the night just in time to find him waiting patiently by the back door, and he'd never even stepped foot into the bedroom to wake me. One afternoon, my fiancé was sitting on the couch with the dog while I was napping in the other room. I had sound-dampening headphones on with music playing to block out distractions. Out of nowhere, I woke up, convinced the dog was whining. I threw on pants and shoes, walked into the living room, and asked what was wrong. She looked at me, confused, and said, "Nothing. He's been quiet." We both turned to look at the dog. He let out the tiniest little, "I need outside" whine, barely audible, then trotted to the back door. It gave both of us chills. After that, it kept happening. I'd be out in my workshop, far from the house, and suddenly, I'd hear him. 2 minutes later, my fiancé would appear, letting him out. To the day he died, I could tell what that dog needed, when he needed it, no matter how far away I was. Now, I have a 2-year-old husky, and I've started noticing it again, hearing things my partner doesn't. I'm not psychic, but sometimes I think maybe some dogs are. Story 8. Through a series of weird circumstances, I had never met my best friend's older sister's best friend, despite being super close to the sister and constantly hanging out at their house. One night, we finally all ended up together, sitting around the kitchen table chatting. She and I quickly bonded over our mutual obsession with cats, swapping stories about the ones we'd loved and lost. I told her the awful story of how my cat had gone missing the night of my senior prom, about 3 weeks earlier. He was 13, and I was devastated. I showed her a picture of him, and she got this strange look on her face. "I don't want to get your hopes up," she said, "but he looks a lot like this cat my dad's been feeding in our backyard for about 3 weeks. He didn't have a collar, but he's pretty chonky." It was nearly 11 p.m., but my friend and I jumped straight into my car and drove to her house. As soon as I stepped out and called his name, he came running. My heart just about exploded. To be absolutely sure, I checked. He was missing a tooth from a previous adventure. It was him. He'd wandered 3 miles away, ended up in her backyard, and by some impossible twist of fate, I'd told his story to the one person who knew where he was. The stars aligned that night, and I got my baby boy back. Even now, years later, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. Story 9. When my brother and I were in our teens, around 13-14, we moved from living with our mother in a small town in upstate New York down to living with our father in Central Florida. We went to school down there and lived in one of those housing developments that are everywhere in Florida. Being new to the area, we didn't have many friends, but eventually we became good friends with a guy who lived a few houses down from us, who actually had his driver's license. We spent that year driving around with our new friend, let's call him Don, going to the roller rink and camping, just the kind of stuff young kids with a car could do. He was older, 17, but a really cool dude. Eventually, my father ran into some problems, and we had to move back to New York with our mother. We lost all contact with Don. This was before the days of the internet or social media, so we never heard from him again. Years later, when I was in my mid-20s, I was sitting at home in northern New York when there was a knock at the door. I opened it and saw Don from Florida standing there. I was stunned. He hadn't changed a bit from when we were kids, just older. I asked him what he was doing in New York and why he had come all this way to find me. He explained that he had been adopted, and as he got older, wanted to find his real parents. He discovered that his biological mother had passed away and couldn't find his father. While tracking down his mother's family, he found out she had a sister who lived in the same town I live in. On a whim, Don asked his cousin if she knew 2 guys from upstate New York he used to know. He told her our names. Of course, his cousin knew us. We had grown up in this small town and gone to school together. And that's how my childhood friend from Florida ended up on my front porch in northern New York. Story 10. When I was about 8, I went to this adventure park in the UK, the kind with those big castle-themed wood chip playgrounds. I climbed up one of the little towers, and as I stuck my head inside the small wooden room at the top, I was greeted by a truly horrifying sight. A massive turd in the corner, swarmed with flies, and next to it, a pair of blue socks absolutely covered in crap. Disgusting? Yes. Scarring? Maybe a little. But I shrugged it off. Weird things happen in kids' parks, right? Fast forward 7 years. I'm 15, living on the other side of the country, and I've just become best friends with this kid on my street. We're inseparable. Still best friends 16 years later, actually. One day, we're chatting about random childhood stuff, and that same theme park comes up. He laughs and says, "Oh man, I went there once when I was 8. I actually took a dump in one of those little castle towers and wiped myself with my socks." I froze. I asked him what color the socks were. "Blue," he says. I ask him which tower. He describes it perfectly. So yeah, when I was 8, I climbed into a castle tower and saw my future best friend's poop. Didn't meet him until 7 years later. Still can't decide if that's fate or a curse. Story 11. I used to host trivia at this cool little bar restaurant. A group would come in regularly, and over time, I became friends with them. One guy in particular, Matt, and I had a lot in common since we worked in the same industry and both loved video games. For the next couple of months, the group and I would hang out after trivia at my place and really got to know each other. One night, my family came to trivia. When they arrived, I went over to say hi, and my sister pointed to a table and said, "I think that kid played at my wedding." Here's the backstory. My sister's a police officer, and one day she got a call about some kids possibly doing drugs at an abandoned warehouse. When she showed up, it turned out to be 3 young guys shooting a music video, and they nearly shit their pants when they saw the cops. Once the misunderstanding was cleared up, they all started chatting, and my sister ended up asking them if they'd be interested in playing at her wedding. The boys were so relieved they weren't getting arrested that they said yes immediately. It was a paid gig after all. This was about 7 years ago. So back to trivia night. One of those boys from the warehouse, the one who played cello, was Matt. I went over and asked him if he played cello, had a run-in with the police at a warehouse, and played at a wedding in 2013. He looked completely shocked and said yes, asking how the hell I knew that. I pointed over to my sister and asked, "Was it that person's wedding?" He looked over, recognized her instantly, and waved. I said, "That's my sister." Both our heads just about exploded. Story 12. When I was around 13, I played a lot of a video game called Diablo 2. I started a clan with a few people I'd met on the internet, and we played every day. One day, we were helping some random player who later asked to join our clan. He seemed nice enough, so we let him in. As part of our clan, we had a shared account that we used to store game items for each other. After about a month of playing, this new guy went in, changed the password, stole the account, unfriended everyone, and completely disappeared with all of our stuff. Fast forward a year later, my family moves to Texas, and it's my first day at a new school. I'm sitting in algebra class talking to the person next to me, and he mentions he plays Diablo. I said, "Me too," and told him I even ran a clan. I asked for his username, and it was him. 2,000 miles away from where I first met this guy online, he's now sitting next to me in math class. When I told him my username, his face went into total shock. He didn't know what to say. It was definitely awkward. I told him I didn't care anymore and was over it, but let's just say we never ended up becoming friends. Story 13. When I was 18, I lived in a town far away from where I eventually ended up moving. While I was there, I became friends with a guy from work. We played Halo, watched movies, and hung out all the time. He was awesome. Then I had to move suddenly because of a family emergency, and I never got his contact information. I didn't even remember his name a decade later, but I thought of him often over the years. He had been such a great friend. Fast forward 11 years. I'm working at my job and carpooling with someone from my training class. One night, he asks if I mind his roommate riding with us, since the guy needed the car after our shift. He introduces us. I turn around, and sitting in the back seat is the guy from that town so long ago. We reconnected instantly, and now we live together. He's my best friend, and the godfather to my children. Story 14. I went to college and met a cute girl. "Where'd you go to high school?" she asked. "You've never heard of it," I replied. I grew up in a town of about 200 people and graduated with a class of around 90. "Try me," she said. That was the beginning of finding out that not only had she heard of it, she had almost attended it. Her family had lived in one of the neighboring towns for a short time when she was growing up. We shared dozens of mutual friends and had apparently spent our entire childhoods narrowly missing each other. Later, after we started dating, we learned that one of those mutual friends had actually been trying to set us up for years. She couldn't stop laughing when she found out we'd finally ended up together, completely without her help. Eventually, I asked her to marry me, and she said yes. We went out to dinner with our parents so they could finally meet. Her folks arrived at the restaurant, saw mine, and her mom said, "Oh, hey, my dad's name. So this is your son, huh?" Turns out they had been co-workers years ago. Of course, we've been married for 11 years now. It's a good thing we've got going, and we fully intend to keep it. Story 15. My parents got divorced when I was 2, and I hadn't seen my dad since I was 5 in 1997. As far as I knew, he was dead. My mom made it very clear she would not answer any questions, and that he had left because he didn't want me. In February 2017, my ex got a call from a neighbor a street over saying he had found our cat's collar and wanted to return it. When my ex went over, the man introduced himself, and he had my very uncommon last name. My ex came home and asked me what my dad's first name was. Of course, it matched. I didn't remember what he looked like or his voice or anything, but I decided to just call him. One of the best decisions I've ever made. Everything my mom had said was a lie. Around the time my dad fell off, she had married a financially stable man. Strange coincidence, huh? My dad had taken her to court trying to see me up until the late 2000s. He had stayed in contact with my grandparents, and every time he spoke to them, he begged them to talk to my mom or at least let me know he was alive. She refused every time. He hadn't seen me in 20 years, yet he still had my kindergarten picture framed in his living room. He was actually proud of me, even though all he had to go by was second-hand information. My dad passed away last June, so I only got about 2 years with him, but he was such an incredible person. I will never forgive my mother. Story 16. In my grade 10 English class, the teacher didn't have anything planned for us to do. It was near the end of the year, so she went to the big cupboard in the corner and pulled out a stack of photocopies. They were examples of successful essays written during past final exams, meant to show us what a good one looks like and how to build a strong narrative. The topic for these essays was, what was the most pivotal moment of your life? There were 3 examples, each showing a different level of proficiency. We read through the first 2, and then I volunteered to read the last one aloud. I started reading, and then I stopped. The essay was about me. It turned out my big sister had written it 6 years earlier, and it was about the day I was born. She'd gotten a really good mark on it, and now here I was, reading it out loud in front of the whole class. I got pretty emotional about that one. Story 17. Okay, I'll put this here. Coincidence? I don't know. It really messed me up. Every couple of years, I'll reach out to old friends and ask, this happened, right? Just to make sure I haven't turned it into some big fish story. The Trans-Canada Highway runs around the edge of my town. It's been 4-laned now, with all the intersections turned into cloverleafs and flyovers. But back in '97, it had intersections and turning lanes, several of them very dangerous. One such turning lane was a left-hand turn at the bottom of a small slope. At night, you'd come over that rise going about 90 km/h and wouldn't really see a car in the turn lane until it was too late. Most locals knew about it and would already be prepared to move right. Besides, there wasn't much down that road, so it was rare for anyone to be sitting there waiting to turn. Enter my friend Dave. Dave had a Honda Civic, and back when gas was 0.36 a liter, driving around was pretty much what you did in a small town. One Saturday, I was working at the gas station when Dave walked up, and Dave never walked anywhere, with this big goofy grin on his face. He told me the Civic had been totaled the night before. As he explained it, he'd been waiting to turn left onto the highway, and the next thing he remembered was standing on the side of the road surrounded by pieces of his car, EMTs, police, and firefighters just staring at him, and one man in a pickup truck crying and apologizing. Nothing was left of the Civic. Apparently, the first responders couldn't figure out how Dave had survived. Dave was a storyteller, so I took it with a grain of salt. But all week, people kept giving him looks, rumors were spreading, and Dave just kept talking about how he'd cheated death. It was eerie. Fast forward to the next Friday. Exactly 1 week later. I get a call from our mutual friend Nate. "Dave's dead," he says. I couldn't believe it. Apparently Nate and Dave were out driving, and Dave insisted on revisiting the crash site. Nate said he was determined to go. So they're sitting in that same left turn lane, and sure enough, another pickup truck comes over the hill. The driver spots them at the last second and swerves. Nate said they barely touched bumpers. His truck just jolted forward and to the right a couple of feet. Nothing major, except when Nate looked over, Dave was unresponsive. When the truck lurched forward, Dave's head hit the spot where the seatbelt attaches to the frame, and that was it. Exactly 1 week after surviving a 1 in a million crash, he died from a 1 in a million bump on the head. I've never been superstitious, but I still struggle to call that a coincidence. Story 18. I was at a convention once. There were only a few people in the room. My friend and I wanted an autograph from a voice actor, and at one point he started singing in his character's voice. 2 random guys were standing next to me, and one of them pulled out a video camera to record it. Years later, my husband and I were talking with friends, and that same convention came up. Turns out, the guy with the video camera was my husband. I even found an old photo I took later that day of the crowd, and there he was, right in the picture. I stood next to my husband years before I ever met him. Story 19. I don't know if this really counts as a coincidence, since it might just be influenced by the things my dad and I had in common, but while reading through one of his old journals, I found out that he and I shared the same recurring nightmare. The details were almost identical, right down to how often it happened. About once a month. It really threw me for a loop. Edit. Just to answer a few FAQs, and as far as I can remember, I never discussed this dream with my dad. I felt okay reading his journal because he's been gone for quite a while now. Before his time, but not in any way related to the dream, he ended it. You can interpret that however you wish. Story 20. Back in the early to mid-90s, the phone system changed, so you no longer needed to dial the area code for long-distance in-state calls. We're a small state with only one area code. One morning, I woke up to the sound of the phone ringing. When I answered, I immediately recognized the voice on the other end. It was my old boss from a few years earlier. She had an unmistakable voice. We chatted for a bit before she realized she dialed the wrong number. I was living in a different town, in a different part of the state, but her intended number must have been off by only 1 digit. And to top it all off, I had overslept that morning. If she hadn't accidentally called me, I would have been late for work. Story 21. 2 of my favorite coincidences happened during separate canoe trips. The first was on a Labor Day weekend trip along the St. Croix River, 2 days paddling upstream, 1 down. The river runs between Wisconsin and Minnesota before eventually joining the Mississippi. Despite it being a holiday weekend, there was almost no traffic. We saw only 1 other boat, and that was on the first day, not long after we set out. On the second day, the weather was quite warm. At one point I said, "Boy, a watermelon sure would be good right about now." My 3 companions immediately told me to shut up and not even mention it, since we obviously didn't have one and weren't going to find one in the middle of the wilderness. A little while later, we spotted a green object floating toward us. Sure enough, it was a watermelon. Years later, I was on another river outing, this time on the Whitewater River in Indiana. I was paddling my kayak and had just finished telling the watermelon story to the people in the canoe next to me. It was a hot summer day, and someone joked, "Watermelons are fine, but I could really go for a cold beer right now." A few minutes later, we rounded a bend and saw a cooler sitting on a sandbar. We stopped, opened it up, and found just enough cold beers for everyone to have one. Appalachian trail hikers call moments like that trail magic. I guess it happens on rivers too. Story 22. When I was 18, I dated a girl who went to a private school. She told me they were having a dance, and I thought, great, sounds like a fun night. Then she explained that only boys from one specific private boys' school were allowed to attend because of an incident the last time they opened it up to everyone. Apparently, some girl got really drunk and puked on the headmaster's shoes. So after that, they decided to limit who could come. Fast forward 12 years. I'm with my fiancée, a different girl, at a wedding shower. I overhear her saying, "I was so embarrassed when I puked on the headmaster's shoes." I shouted, "That was you! That's awesome! I love you even more now that you're famous." TLDR. My wife deblocked me 12 years before we even met. Story 23. Last summer, I went to New York with my family for a week. A friend of mine, someone I hadn't seen since she graduated from college, was living and working in the city at the time, so we decided to meet up for drinks. As we were walking through Times Square at 11 p.m. on a Saturday, who do we spot on the other side of the street but another friend from college? I knew he'd been living in New Jersey, but it turned out he was in New York for a grinder date. The three of us ended up going to a bar together, catching up and talking about life, about how none of our old friends still live in Ireland anymore, how everyone seems to have moved abroad. It was bittersweet, and such a wild coincidence that three friends from a small university in Dublin would just happen to reunite by chance in the middle of New York City. Story 24. I knew a girl in high school who was just the worst type of person. It'd take too long to explain all the reasons, but a big one was that she tried to drive a wedge between my best friend and me. She moved away after high school. My friend and I would occasionally bring her up, talking about some of her worst qualities and how glad we were that we'd never have to see her again. One time, we were doing exactly that in a restaurant, and suddenly, she appeared right next to our table. She'd come back to visit someone and just happened to be there at the exact moment we were talking about her. So awkward. 5 minutes of pure awkwardness. Then she left. My friend and I just sat there like, what the heck? Story 25. My old workplace ran a Secret Santa one year, the week before Christmas. The limit was $10 and the person I was buying for was someone I didn't know very well. I left my shopping until the last minute because I had no idea what to get her. One day, while walking through town, I spotted an old copy of Oliver Twist in the window of a secondhand bookstore. It just called to me, so I went in and picked it up. I checked the first page for the price, $10. Perfect. On the day of the Secret Santa, there were about 150 people opening gifts. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a crowd around a woman who was crying. People were calling for the person who had been her Santa. I went over and revealed it was me. She hugged me, still crying, and explained that 10 years earlier, her house had burned down, along with all her possessions. The book I had bought her was her favorite, and it was the exact same edition she remembered, right down to the cover. Because it was secondhand, it was even weathered in the same places she remembered. It was as if I had somehow grabbed the book from her shelf before the fire and delivered it back to her a decade later. Story 26. I had this dream where my friend and I ran into Biggie Smalls. He was alive in the dream world, and he invited us to a party that night. We decided we should bring him a gift, and I suggested we get him a water dragon, one of those big lizards, because let's be honest, Biggie would look dope rocking a water dragon on his shoulder. So we started walking to the party with the lizard, and when we passed through the local park, I looked down and saw a snap-lock bag filled with white powder lying next to a bench. We took it and ended up partying with Biggie all night. The next morning, I woke up and went to make a coffee. I turned on the radio. Party and Bullshit was playing. I thought that was a weird coincidence, given the dream, but didn't think too much of it, until I walked outside. Right there on my porch was a water dragon. They show up around my place maybe 2 or 3 times a year. But still, the timing was wild. Later that day, I told my mate about the dream and joked, "Watch me find a bag of powder at the park later." That night, as I was walking to his house, I decided to humor the idea. I walked over to the same bench from my dream, and there it was, a bag of powder, exactly where I dreamed it would be. I definitely disposed of the bag though. My friends and I absolutely did not spend the night blasting Biggie Smalls and hypothetically having the best time of our lives. That would be preposterous. Story 27. When I was at university in Toronto, I was flying to England for a debating tournament. I booked my flight and then told my partner the date and time so he could book his as well. The day before we left, we agreed to meet at a particular subway station and take the subway to the end of the line to catch the bus to the airport. The next day, I arrived at the subway station at the agreed time, but he didn't show up. This was pre-cell phone days, so I couldn't call him. Eventually, I had to go, so I took the subway and bus to the airport and went to the gate. Still no sign of him. I even had him paged over the loudspeaker, but nothing. When I asked the gate agent to check the passenger list, it turned out he wasn't on it. Confused, I boarded my flight to London. I did find him the next day in London, but that's another story. Almost as coincidental. It turned out that while I was on one level of the subway station waiting to travel north to catch a bus to Terminal 1 for my flight, he was on the other level, waiting to travel west to catch a bus to Terminal 2 for his flight, which was at the exact same time on the same day, but on a different airline. At every step of the way, we had been describing identical routes, but somehow, we never overlapped. Story 28. Living in a small town in Texas at the time, we always took in dog rescues to help find them homes. It got to the point that people would just dump them in our backyard. One day, 4 dogs showed up. 2 puppies, a brindle, and a beagle. We immediately got the puppies adopted since they were young and cute. Fast forward 8 months. We'd tried adopting out the male beagle twice. Both times he was returned. The brindle was an extremely tragic case. I won't get into it, but she was the mother, and the beagle was the father of the puppies. One Sunday, I decided to swing by the volunteer-run animal shelter down the road from our house. I'd driven past it for 3 years, but never stopped. I knew the owner, and honestly, didn't care much for her. But something about their new cages caught my eye, so why not? It was closed anyway. As we got out and looked around, I noticed a green truck parked in the driveway and shrugged it off. Then a woman came around the corner and asked if we worked there. We told her no and asked what she needed. She said she was interested in adopting a dog. She'd been living in a different town about 10 miles away for the last few months, and today she wanted to check the shelter. Her dog had run away about 10 months earlier. I told her we had 2 available, a brindle and a beagle. She immediately said her missing dog was a beagle. At that moment, it clicked. Somehow, some way, her beagle had ended up in our yard. And then, coincidentally, we met her that day at a place I'd driven past almost every day but never stopped at. The brindle, it turned out, was his girlfriend from next door. She would escape with him. Their previous owners had skipped out on rent and weren't nice people. She took her beagle, who had been missing for nearly a year, home that day. The final coincidence? We had named the beagle Bagel. His original name, Brownie, food names. Story 29. In high school, this girl and I had a full-on Nemeses thing going. We couldn't stand each other, but somehow we were part of the same friend group. Even though we never hung out at the same time, completely by accident, we kept learning little things about each other through mutual friends. The funny part? Our lives were almost identical. With every new coincidence, our rivalry just got more intense. Our names were eerily similar. Think Anna and Hannah. We traveled to the same countries and cities, attended almost all the same concerts, had overlapping friend groups from another city, and even shared extracurricular activities. Then one day, during theater class, I overheard her telling another girl that she was the niece of a very famous writer in my country. I immediately called her out, 100% sure she was lying, because I actually was the niece of that writer. We argued, then texted our families to check, and wouldn't you know it, we were semi-distant cousins. Ridiculous, right? Neither of us ever mentioned it again. We just carried on hating each other for the rest of the year. Like nothing happened. Story 30. Here in my little town in northwest England, there's a great kebab shop that the lads and I have been ordering from for years. We've been there after countless nights out and had deliveries to our doors, so we know the guys who work there pretty well. They're mostly Turkish. One time, a few of us went on a short break to Turkey. After getting off the plane, we waited in the car park for another friend who'd been on a different flight. As we stood there, soaking in the ambience of a new country, none other than the tall guy from our local kebab shop walked right across the road in front of us, 2,000 miles from home. That was weird. Story 31. I went on a 3-week trip through Costa Rica about 4 years ago. I realized I needed a new pair of shorts since I hadn't brought enough. We couldn't find any regular clothing stores, so we ended up in a shop that sold secondhand clothes. They sourced their clothes from all over the world, wherever people collected items for the less fortunate. Back in the Netherlands, we call it Humanitas, and there are collection bins all over the country. I bought an ugly pair of cargo shorts. Later, I found a 3-year-old festival token in one of the pockets, from a festival that takes place just 20 kilometers from my home. I'm sure it wasn't mine, because I'd never been to that festival. So these shorts had traveled all the way from my hometown to Costa Rica, only to be flown back there by me. Story 32. I had recently moved cities and gotten a new local phone number. Naturally, I had to make a lot of calls to various utilities and services to get everything set up. I called one company and was speaking with the customer service rep. Everything was going fine until she asked for my phone number. When I told her, she completely freaked out. "Who are you? How did you find me? How do you know that number?" It took a while, but I eventually calmed her down enough to figure out what was going on. It turned out she had been in an abusive relationship. Her ex had stalked and harassed her, including making threatening calls with his friends. Eventually, she had moved to a different part of the city and gotten a new unlisted phone number. My new number was her old one. The moment I said it, she assumed her ex had tracked her down and that the harassment was about to start all over again. I'm not sure she fully believed me when I explained everything, but we eventually managed to get through the call. Story 33. Oh man, to this day, I'm amazed by this. I was in the process of moving to France for school and needed to get a visa from a consultant in Chicago, 6 hours from my hometown. My dad dropped me off at the building for the appointment. During the appointment, I realized I had forgotten a piece of paperwork. The woman working there said that if I left to get it, I'd have to reschedule the whole appointment, but if my dad brought it, that would be fine. I went to call him, only to realize my phone had completely died. Dead as dead can get. Sheepishly, I asked a girl about my age sitting in the lobby if I could use hers. She said yes, and to my surprise, her case was for my university. Turns out we went to the same school, and she was getting a visa for another city in France. We chatted a bit about professors and programs, I thanked her, and then my dad arrived so I could finish my appointment. But here's where it gets insane. A year later, I was moving back home from France. I had bought a business class seat because, well, wow, air sucks on long flights otherwise. I noticed a girl looking puzzled at me 2 rows behind. She looked very familiar. Everyone got off the plane, and she came up to me and asked if I remembered her. Then it hit me. It was the same girl from the Consulate. She had extended her stay in France, and we both had a good laugh about the odds of running into each other like that. Story 34. I have 2. The first, about 20 years ago, my family and I lived in Germany. My parents and sister had lived there for about 12 years before I was born. One day, my mom, sister, and I were walking through an open marketplace when my mom said, "I wonder what happened to Mrs. XYZ, you know, the lady who babysat you, my sister, when you were a baby." Not 10 minutes later, my mom stops a random woman in the market and asks, "Excuse me, are you Mrs. XYZ?" "Yup." We hadn't seen her in over a decade, and we happened to find her immediately after my mom mentioned her name. The second, this just happened this week. I'm a teacher, and I usually have music playing in the classroom as kids walk in. I had Smooth Criminal by MJ playing when a kid walks in and says, "Whoa, this is the same song my iPod played as my alarm this morning." Less than a minute later, a different kid walks in and says, "Whoa, this is the same song my Sonos played as my alarm this morning." Of all the songs possible, me, Apple, and Sonos all picked the same one on the exact same day. Story 35. This happened to my mom about 10 years ago. When she was around 13, she lived on Midway Island with my grandparents because my grandpa was a Navy officer. She had a water skiing accident where she basically slammed her face into the seawall because she didn't let go of the rope in time, leaving a scar on her forehead that she covered with her bangs. Fast forward 45 years. She's working at a retirement facility, coordinating outings for residents. A new resident arrived, and while talking to him about his life, he mentioned he was in the Navy. My mom thought that was cool since her dad was too. Then he said he had been stationed on Midway Island, and during the 1960s, the same time my mom was there. He went on to say he hated it because the only interesting thing that ever happened was when an officer's daughter didn't let go of the rope while water skiing, slammed into the seawall, and cracked her head open, and he had to save her. My mom was totally shocked. She pulled her bangs aside to show him the scar and said, "I was that officer's daughter. Coolest coincidence ever." Story 36. A few years ago, I spontaneously decided I was going to go on a solo camping trip to watch a blood moon eclipse. I had 0 camping experience, so deciding to do this on a whim was already pretty random. I asked around for good spots and ended up being recommended one of the small lakes in the Adirondacks. Off I went. The night of the eclipse, I got to a nearby bridge way before sunset to make sure I had a good spot. I stayed there the entire night. Lots of people came and stayed, but many just pulled over for a minute or two to glance at the eclipse before moving on. A couple months later, I was telling one of my longtime friends, who I'd always had a crush on, about the trip when he came home from college. He paused for a moment and said, "I know that bridge, just past the town, over the river." Turns out he had happened to be driving through that night and pulled over at that exact same spot, but on the opposite side of the road. It was insane. It felt like a really cool fairy tale type coincidence when we started dating afterward. But then, he turned out to be a psycho, so it just became a wasted plot point. Lame. Edit. Forgot to mention, this was 6 to 7 hours away from my hometown, so it wasn't just a nearby local area. Story 37. How I met my husband. You know how they say you won't find someone until you stop looking? On the way to the club with my cousin, I said, "I don't want to look for a guy tonight. I just want to have fun." I'd had a streak of bad luck in that department. Anyway, we were dancing and hanging out. I went outside for a smoke and was talking to a guy friend glancing around. That's when I saw him, standing by a guy I knew was friends with my cousin. I can't explain it, but it was this "I have to go talk to him" moment. I was usually too shy to approach guys loaded with insecurities, but in mid-sentence, I interrupted my friend with something like, "Uh-huh. I've got to go." I went over and said, "Hi, you look bored." At first, he gave me a "who's talking to me?" kind of look like I was being annoying. Then he did a double take, and the biggest smile lit up his face. Here's the weird part. Apparently, he had seen me first. His friend thought he knew me, and he did, but not in the way he expected. The whole reason he was outside was to get introduced to me. So it was a complete surprise when I came up to him first. We got together 2 weeks later and have been inseparable ever since. Story 38. My dad passed away last summer. While I was making calls to let the rest of the family know the news, I ran across the number of one of my dad's childhood friends, someone he had kept in touch with over the years. The number must have been old and disconnected because I couldn't get in touch with him. I was deeply disappointed that my dad's best friend, probably one of his only friends, wouldn't be able to make it to the funeral. I tried reaching out to anyone who might know how to contact him, but had no luck. Days went by, and the day of the funeral arrived. After the service, on the way from the funeral home to the cemetery, I got a call through my dad's phone. It was his friend, calling to say he was coming into the state and wanted to make sure my father would be available. It absolutely shook me. I told him my dad had passed away a few days earlier, that he had just missed the funeral, and that we were on our way to the cemetery. A couple of hours later, he met my mother and me and was able to say his final goodbyes to my father. I'll never get over the fact that he happened to be on his way down for a visit on the very day of my dad's funeral, but I'm grateful he was able to be there to send him off. Story 39. I got a new computer and was scrolling through pictures on my old one with my little brother. I came across a photo I loved, 2 butterflies, one blue, one yellow, perched on a large purple flower. I'd always thought it was such a lucky shot. The colors were so vivid, and the butterflies were patient enough to let me take 3 shots before they flew away. My brother was in awe of it, and I said, "Wow, you really like this one?" He pulled out his phone and said, "No, I took this photo." Sure enough, he had gone to the same park the summer after I took my picture. His photo featured the same species of plant and butterflies, in the same park, around the same area and time of day. What are the chances? This happened years ago. I'll have to see if he still has his photo, and maybe post them both later. Story 40. My wife and I had been trying to get pregnant for a couple of months. One amazing day, I came home to find out she had peed on a stick. And guess what? We were pregnant. We scheduled an appointment with the doctor to confirm and start prenatal care. On the way to that first appointment, I ended up behind a white Lexus SUV. The license plate read TWN Boys. I thought, that's a weird license plate. I turned to my wife and mentioned it, and we laughed, joking about the coincidence. When we got to the doctor, she looked at the ultrasound and said, "Oh goodness, do you see what I see?" My wife started crying tears of joy, and I had no idea what was happening. There were 2 sacs. We were having twins. Fast forward a few months and we wanted to do a gender reveal. I play hockey, so what better way than chalk hockey pucks? I shot the first puck, blue powder, took a moment, shot the second, blue powder again. We were 6 months along with our healthy twin boys. Story 41. A few months ago, my car got written off outside my house, hit by a young girl on her way home from work late on a Friday night. About a month later, I had my insurance payout and was online looking for a new car. I remembered that when I was with my ex, we had gone to a really good secondhand car dealership when she was looking for a new car. I decided it would be a good place to check, but I couldn't remember where it was or what it was called. So I texted my ex, we're still friends, to see if she could remember. She couldn't. About 10 minutes later, I decided I liked the look of the Scoda Fabia VRS and went on YouTube to watch some reviews. The very first video I clicked on focused on the back of a Scoda. As the car pulled away and the camera zoomed out, there it was. The dealership I'd just texted my ex about, right in the middle of the screen. I paused the video, took a screenshot, and sent it to my ex, joking about the coincidence. She replied, saying it was weird. I was pretty mind-blown. Out of millions of videos on YouTube, I clicked on one that literally answered a question I'd just asked. I figured I should tell my brother. He's into cars and would likely be coming with me to view some. I texted him the story and he replied, "That's weird. But do you want to know something even weirder?" Of course I asked. He told me that the dealership in the video was where he bought his VW Jetta a few years back. Even stranger, that Jetta was the same car I bought from him, the one that had gotten written off at the very beginning of this story. I figured something was calling me to that dealership, so I went there the following Saturday. Unfortunately, there was nothing on the forecourt that I liked or that suited my budget. I ended up buying a BMW Wonder 23D from halfway down the country. I still have pictures of the crashed cars, and I think I still have the screenshot of the dealership from the YouTube video. If anyone wants to see, I can send them. It's wild. Story 42. One summer in high school, my mom and I went to NYC for a week. We lived in California. Her youngest cousin, also from CA, was a PhD student at NYU at the time, but we didn't tell him we were in town. She had work, he might be busy, etc. On our way somewhere, we accidentally took the 6 train in the wrong direction. After 2 stops, we got off somewhere in Midtown to switch sides. Lo and behold, there was her cousin, standing on the platform, looking at us in disbelief and saying, "Hi," my mom's nickname. He was going somewhere completely out of his ordinary routine, and we should never have been at that stop. It was awesome. We all ended up seeing Avenue Q together the next night. Story 43. Last week, I was at work on a job when my coworker struck up a conversation with the homeowner. My coworker mentioned that his parents live across the street and asked how long the homeowner had lived there. The homeowner said he'd only been in the city a few months, having just moved from a small town several hours away. My coworker laughed and said he was born and raised in that town. Then he asked, "Do you know the miniplex at the corner of X Street and Y Street? I lived right across from it." The homeowner looked confused. "Do you mean 103 X Street? That was my house." They talked more and discovered that my coworker's parents had sold their house to this homeowner when they moved to the city. The homeowner had lived there for 15 years before selling it to move to the same city, across the street from the previous owners. Small world. Story 44. My wife and I were looking to hire a caterer for our wedding, and when we met, my wife and the caterer started talking about their lives a bit. It turned out they had both literally grown up on the same street in a city of 10 million people. On the other side of the world, both had left the city about a decade earlier before immigrating to our current country. They knew the same people, hung out at the same coffee shop, attended the same church, and even used to grab mangoes off the same large tree that hung over the wall of one of the big houses in the neighborhood. Yet they had never met, until meeting almost exactly on the opposite side of the planet, in a small town of about 50,000 people. Story 45. Not me, but a story I heard. A guy from the UK was on holiday in Greece. He went for a walk and passed a public phone, which suddenly started ringing. On a whim, he answered, and it was his bank, calling about some unusual activity on his account. The bank started asking him questions, but he was still stunned. How did his bank know where he was? This was the early 90s. There was no way for them to track him like that. He asked how they got this number. The bank said it was the number they had on file. He insisted that couldn't be right because he was in Greece and this was a public phone. The bank investigated and realized what happened. Instead of dialing his phone number, they had accidentally dialed his account number, which just happened to be the exact number of this public phone box in another country. And, amazingly, he just happened to be walking past it at the exact moment they called. What are the odds of that happening? Absolutely mind-blowing. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.